some people will look at that and say, you teamed up and bought an election.
At the end of the day, voters voted. We educated voters, as many industries do, about candidates.
But you helped supercharge the candidates with the money in the coffers, right? On
We
whatever
absolutely
they
did.
they wanted to talk about.
That's absolutely right.
So in your mind, is the message for any lawmaker looking to run for office that they have to take your industry seriously, fear your industry?
Today's episode is brought to you by Akash Network, the world's premier decentralized compute marketplace. Check out Akash to buy and sell computing resources securely and efficiently. Purpose-built for public utility at akash.network. Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Coinage. I'm your host, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios here in Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn studios in Brooklyn, New York. That seems a little redundant to start the day. I'm Rusty. I was in Prague. Sometimes I forget where I am, but we're here, and it's back to flirting with $100,000 territory on the Bitcoin chart. Some interesting moves to kick off the week, as always, as it has become somewhat of a norm. MicroStrategy out with another huge Bitcoin buy. We'll dig into that, as well as maybe some international implications as El Salvador takes its foot off the gas pedal in becoming the Bitcoin place to be. Potentially some added competition from President Trump in terms of being the crypto president. Maybe it's not so big for them to be the Bitcoin capital of the world anymore. We'll dig into what's going on there, how it's impacting potential moves in Argentina, as well as a 60 Minutes hit piece. Some people are saying that's what it was. I don't know if it was really that, though. We'll play a clip. We'll let you decide. And of course, on the theme of letting you decide, it is time to move on in our Crypto Project of the Year celebration competition, dare we say, as our NFT holders continue. Thank you to those of you who are watching and who have voted thus far to crown Crypto's Project of the Year. It was exciting to see those interviews go live. If you haven't watched them yet, Coinage.media. At the top is the banner where you can go and find all of our interviews with the top projects in crypto. I think this is the most important thing we do every year because we have the founders on to dig into why their projects are so transformational, what they've done this year, what's ahead for next year, alpha leaks galore. And quite frankly, these are the projects that were up considerably over the last cycle, and I think some of them are well-positioned, if not all of them are well-positioned, to continue that progress into 2025. So we're going to dig into all of that today on the show, but first, let's start with the charts, per usual. In terms of where we're at right now, as I said, flirting with 100K on the Bitcoin chart. 97 is where we're at, about 98. As you see, things took a little bit of a turn right when we were planning to come on air. And so we'll see where that goes. But obviously, if you back up, just put it in the month perspective here, and that's basically where we've been flirting. Texas, our producer over here, saying that he's getting a little nervous because Sean Farrell's call for 115K, he's only got about what? It's December 9th. He's only got a few days left in the year to hit that 115K, $1,000. 115K price target. We'll see what happens. I'm not counting it out yet. He's a smart guy. Anyways, if you look at the charts as to why I'm not counting it out yet, let's dig into the first thing because it's a record, folks, in terms of investment inflows for crypto investment products per usual. Looking at that chart, a record, according to CoinShares, $3.85 billion, the number of inflows. It's the largest weekly inflows on record, smashing what was the prior record just a few weeks ago. As you see, the uptrend is there. That little tick down is mostly because I think of Thanksgiving and some people had some things to do, us included here at Coinage. But it's pretty big in terms of not just Bitcoin. You're also seeing interest across the other crypto tokens too, Solana, Ethereum. It's pretty impressive. Not to be lost in all of that either are equities. A lot of Bitcoin miners catching a bid as well as Bitcoin pumps. And as we mentioned, it's also an increasingly true statement to make when it comes to MicroStrategy buying the top for forever, because not only are we seeing inflows via the ETFs, we're also seeing inflows via MicroStrategy. And as we've covered, that could be potentially problematic depending on how much, that trade turns into a bubble, but for now, nothing to worry about. MicroStrategy acquiring 21,550 Bitcoin this time around from December 2nd to 8th at an average price of 98,783. So basically where we are today is we're speaking to you live on this show, and they made that announcement today as well. So overall, basically another $2.1 billion purchase for Michael Saylor and his friends at MicroStrategy. So that support is still there, and unlikely, as we covered. If you haven't watched it yet, go to our YouTube and watch our full deep dive into MicroStrategy's strategy on buying Bitcoin, because it doesn't sound like we're near the end on that trade. $2 billion this week. I think what? It's honestly hard to keep track in terms of how much, in terms of billions, Michael Saylor's deployed over the last few weeks, but I think we're close to like 10 billion that's been deployed. If it was 2 billion over 7 days, I mean, we're getting pretty close. But the plan was 40 billion and 40 billion, I think, or 42 billion across equity and debt. So still a lot of room to run on that front. And the other thing to maybe point out here is Bitcoin dominance, right? Because we talk so much about Bitcoin, and certainly that has triggered a lot of, the moves that we're seeing right now in the overall crypto market. But increasingly, that's not necessarily the case, because when you look at Bitcoin dominance right now, this chart, pretty interesting to see the way that, Bitcoin essentially amounted to 61% of the market, the entire crypto market just a few weeks ago. And now we're down to 56. So, a lot of people had been waiting to see, hey, when is altcoin season going to get going? And you figured, well, it's not going to get going if MicroStrategy is buying up $2 billion a week and you got all these ETFs sucking in a bunch of capital. It ain't going to happen. But over the last 2 weeks, a lot of people, maybe you just haven't noticed, there have been some massive, insane rallies. And XRP, the front runner of all of that, we're going to chat a little bit about what Brad Garlinghouse said on his 60 Minutes interview in just a second in this show. But, 336% the run-up in XRP over the last month. That is certainly eye-popping in terms of a project that you might not have expected to be one of the leaders in this cycle. No offense to the Ripple army out there. No offense to Eleanor Terrett, a friend of the show who has covered that chain and that community extensively, but just wasn't exactly on the top of the list of projects that had been sitting there. And, if they win in their SEC case, good for them. But I think a lot of the boost that they're receiving really does apply to the entire crypto world. So honestly, the 350% rally there confuses me slightly. If you're watching this and you disagree, feel free to throw a comment. Feel free to throw some sort of context. Enlighten me, please, for the love of God. Because as I sit here, I really can't figure it out. But it's not just Ripple. There are a bunch of other projects. As I said, a lot of the ones that we've covered in our Crypto Project of the Year celebration. Avalanche up 100% over the last month as they continue to see the benefits of their upgrade. Helium, you name it. Basically, any of the other altcoins in our competition right now, they've enjoyed quite a bit of the rally over the last month. So as a result, we're seeing Bitcoin's dominance slide off a cliff, and kind of curious to see how much farther that trend continues. Obviously, that's more of like a late cycle thing. I'm not saying we're there yet. Certainly, I think we got a lot more room to grow with Bitcoin only at $100,000 right now. Even if it doesn't happen by the end of the year, 115K, I think generally, and we'll be chatting with Sean Farrell again this week, as well as Travis Kling, some of the favorite guests of the show. I'd say that trend continues. If it doesn't happen at the end of the year, look towards to January. All of this stuff is in flux, but generally, you cannot fight the trend, and right now the trend is higher. At least here, maybe it's important to take a look outside of the U.S., and that is an interesting story to dig into, because this is where we go expansionary, right? We can talk about inside the U.S. and we can talk about outside the U.S. We can talk about what's happening here. We can talk about the rest of the world. And one of the trends, let's think about the cruxes of this rally, right? You've got Bitcoin ETFs. That's been the big trend of 2024. That hasn't gone anywhere. Those inflows continue. Retail's waking up. Phenomenal. Great. Then you have the idea of companies adding Bitcoin to the balance sheet. Okay, cool. We've seen that with MicroStrategy. Slowly, maybe surely, some progress being made on other companies. And then you've got sovereign countries themselves. El Salvador has been the earliest adopter of doing that. And right now, the U.S. considering a Bitcoin strategic reserve, so that being the internal U.S. story. But the external one in El Salvador, pretty interesting. When you look at the headline that has come out of the Financial Times, which is that El Salvador is scaling back its bet on Bitcoin to seal a $1.3 billion deal from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Now, the details in this story are quite interesting, given that, El Salvador made the pretty crazy step, if you really think about it, years ago, saying that stores, restaurants, anyone had to accept, they were legally required to accept Bitcoin as legal tender. So if you go into a shop, you say, hey, I want to pay with Bitcoin. It was illegal for that store to say no, which is a pretty big step. And now to secure $1.3 billion in funding, essentially the detailed reporting coming out from all this is that essentially they are dropping that requirement for businesses to say that, hey, we need to accept Bitcoin. So that's not going to be included in here. At least that's reporting from the Financial Times, which is pretty interesting given that not a lot of people even took it up, I suppose, right? A lot of people were kind of bearish around the idea of, hey, how many people are actually going to use Bitcoin in El Salvador? Turns out, maybe not that many. And again, as we've covered with the Stacks co-founder, Munib, shout out to what they've been up to, maybe just because it's not really built. Bitcoin Layer 1 isn't really built for payment. So not all that successful sometimes. Of course, there have been other opportunities and other projects focused on making payments quicker. And I'm not knocking those. I'm just saying that, it's kind of interesting to see whether or not that's, a good thing for Bitcoin libertarians to say, hey, you're forcing this on people. It's still the option, by the way. You don't need to pay in Bitcoin, but if you want to, restaurants, stores had to accept it. And so if that's off the table, kind of curious what the knock-on effects might be. And I say that because next up in all of this, in terms of the IMF and whether or not we see another crypto president outside of maybe Trump and perhaps Bukele in El Salvador, if you see someone else maybe step up to the plate, and a lot of people had been focused on Argentina's president in Milei, maybe potentially stepping up in that and being the next Bitcoin president, you do wonder what kind of impact this might have on all of that if El Salvador is backing off being the Bitcoin kind of capital of the world. And Milei is also in some interesting discussions with the IMF. And so when you weigh all those things out on paper together, it doesn't necessarily look bullish in terms of that third prong of countries coming out and saying, hey, you know what? We want to actually start to really lean into Bitcoin and do more of that, especially if it comes at the cost of dealing with the IMF or potentially sabotaging any sort of progress they can make with the IMF, because for Argentina, currently one of the largest debtors to the IMF, it's pretty interesting when you consider that, because Argentina definitely needs the IMF, arguably more so than El Salvador, right now owing $44 billion and trying to get a loan to continue Milei's turnaround down there. All I'm saying is if Bitcoin is that marginal piece that might hurt them with the IMF right now, as they're basically trying to lock that up, and Milei leans into his relationship with Trump to try and lock that up, it is interesting to think about. Maybe they take the foot off the gas. Maybe they're no longer so pro-Bitcoin, or maybe they, look to pivot there. So I'm just bringing that up because it's an important piece of kind of this narrative. Of course, none of that matters if the U.S. decides to actually create their Bitcoin strategic reserve. But for right now, perhaps on the margin, not necessarily a good Bitcoin boost to the narrative. Want to move on to our other friends that we mentioned, Ripple and its CEO, Brad Garlinghouse, on 60 Minutes, catching a lot of people's attention because it was the first kind of mainstream coverage since we've seen Bitcoin hit 100K, at least on one of those nighttime primetime news shows. And partial piece of that interview, some say, was a bit of a hit piece. As a journalist, I will just say, sometimes you have to answer hard questions. Sometimes an interviewer might come at you with a question that's maybe, dare I say, not provided by the company itself to a KOL. And in this sense, it was a question like that. They hit Brad Garlinghouse with a question. Obviously, Ripple paid a bunch of money to Fairshake, the pro-crypto group influencing the elections in this cycle. It was the most money raised for any industry in this election cycle. So he got hit with a question on 60 Minutes about whether or not that's a good thing, whether or not some people might look at Ripple giving all that money to Fairshake spending so much money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to influence the election this time. Did they buy an election? Take a listen to what we heard on 60 Minutes.
Some people will look at that and say, you teamed up and bought an election.
At the end of the day, voters voted. We educated voters, as many industries do, about candidates.
But you helped supercharge the candidates with the money in the coffers, right? On
We
whatever
absolutely did.
is they wanted to talk about.
That's absolutely right.
So in your mind, is the message for any lawmaker looking to run for office that they have to take your industry seriously, fear your industry?
I think all citizens should want people in Congress, on the Senate and the House, who are going to look to how do we use technologies in a way to benefit citizens.
How do we benefit citizens? I think maybe, I don't know, it's been weird. Obviously, it's tough to argue with the move in XRP, right? As we showed this chart before. I don't think it's easy to argue with them kind of leading this post-election cycle, right? And I guess outwardly, narrative-wise, beating the SEC, certainly a rallying cry around the XRP army. But benefiting citizens is a big question. And I think, this is one of those chains that's mostly aligned with Wall Street. And so it's interesting to think about benefiting citizens and what that looks like, whether or not it's just, hey, number go up, benefits our holders, or is it like, hey, we should start leaning into the projects that are actually decentralized, actually Web3, actually walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And perhaps that is a good segue, Texas, into what our community has already shown us as we continue to roll out the Crypto Project of the Year celebration. This is something that we do every year. It's the only Web3 nominated and performed openly, transparently, and on-chain competition to eventually crown crypto's project of the year as voted on by our NFT holders. So if you're a Coinage NFT holder, you got to go to our site. You got to go through the process to become an official DAO co-owner of what we do here to open yourself up to the eligible patronage dividends that we pay out and will be paying out this year as a U.S. organized and based co-op/DAO. But I want to show the early results of round one because we have them officially after voting closed. And maybe there are some prizes here, maybe there are not. But when you look at the bracket, you got Akash advancing over BitTensor in that D-pin celebration in the upper left part of the bracket. Pretty interesting. Well fought. BitTensor, perhaps too decentralized because difficult to get them on the show. But Greg Osuri back on Coinage, able to convince our community of co-owners that that is a project worth advancing. Facing now Solana. I was just chatting with Mike Cahill out in Prague. He was out there. Pith, take nothing from them. Great year for them. If you haven't watched our interview with them, go check it out. Still think that project has a lot to do in 2025, catching some huge momentum. We still have one that's open, by the way, Base and Sweet. We are going to be publishing that one today. You can check out that interview with Jesse Pollock from Base. Huge year for them, but voting will be opening. So if you haven't registered yet, again, call to action, do that. And Avalanche advancing over Near, perhaps not surprising. And the rest of it, obviously, on your screen as you can check it out. We got Say going up against Stacks. It's interesting because Stacks continues to work with other chains in trying to help bring Bitcoin to these other more performant blockchains. And the bottom right, again, voting still going on in the Thorchain Helium matchup. Our thanks to both of those founders. The only one where we had both of them on. Scheduling made it possible to have JP on the show, along with the founder of Helium, to talk about why they're doing such great things this year. And all these projects, I can't show all you the charts at the same time, but all the projects have already really started to catch a huge bit. I think Thorchain over the last month, as we dug into that in our interview, up like 60%-ish over the last month. So these projects have some real momentum behind them as we do this every year. Really exciting to kind of hear more about what's happening under the hood and why these are nominees for Crypto Project of the Year. So one more call to action if you haven't yet. If you own a Coinage NFT, head to coinage.media to finally complete that onboarding, go through the process to become eligible for patronage dividends, because not only do we have limited time for Bitcoin to hit 115K and prove Sean Farrell's price target, right? But we've only got a limited time for you to vote and become a member in this year, because it goes by calendar year. If you don't do it before the end of the year, I'm sorry, you're shit out of luck, because there's nothing I can do for you. So if you're watching this for the first time, thank you. We do this every Monday to recap the biggest headlines in crypto. As always, you can go to Coinage.media, not just to vote in Crypto Project of the Year, but also to catch the biggest headlines in the space, as we always let our community tell us what we should be covering and what is worthy of coverage here at one of the fastest growing Web3 media outlets in the US. That's going to do it for our show here on Monday. Per usual, I thank you for watching Coinage, and head to Coinage.media to join our project and co-own it with us. Those are the biggest headlines. If you haven't yet subscribed to our newsletter, do that as well at Substack. That's where you can catch us. For Zach Guzman, myself, for everybody here at Coinage, thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you again soon.